I get my very own clicker here. Can you all hear me? Is this thing on? That's interesting. It's like because I can only hear myself. That's sort of weird. I'm not hearing the voice of God coming from the ceiling. That would not be me. So I guess it makes sense. If God comes in, let me know because I might not be able to hear. As Paul just said, I have maybe almost too much history. I've been around open source, not as a coder, but as a writer. The only code I know is Morse, which tells you how old I am. And I was a ham radio operator until I, wanted to move on to other forms of meat, I guess, or something 1,000 years ago. In any case, just to give you a little bit more about myself, because it speaks, the points I want to make here speak a little bit to what open source is about. First is curriculum vitae. CVs aren't what they used to be. I edit Linux Journal, or I'm an editor for Linux Journal. I co-wrote a book called the Cluetrain Manifesto. I now have this gig with the Berkman Center at Harvard University where I'm working on an open source project there. I'm also with another university in California, UCSB, as a fellow. I do a lot of speaking. There are like hundreds or thousands of pictures of me speaking in one place or another out there. And I write this weblog. And so an interesting thing about that is that this morning I did some little bit of vanity searching on Google, and myself in Linux is that much, and Cluetrain's less, and Harvard is that much, and there's Berkman. Conference is a lot more, and the blog is 1,560,000, which turns out to be over 90% of all the 1,700,000 and some odd thousand results. The interesting thing about that is I don't get paid to blog. I don't make money at it at all. In fact, I make money because of it. I make money because I'm blogging. I would not have, I would not have gigs with two universities that never would have let me in if I wasn't writing quotable stuff on the net for many years. It's a crazy thing. There are a lot of people out there giving people advice on how to make money blogging. Well, you don't make money blogging as much as you can make money because of blogging. So it has large because effects. That's something J.P. Rangaswamy wanted me to talk about today, that there's this weird jujitsu that happens with open source. It happens with lots of things. It happens because of the net, where you make more money because of something than you do with it. So that's something I want to talk about. So how does that work? Because effects are not business models, this really stupid, awful thing happened during, I think it was the second bubble, maybe the third. It was the big one in 1999. There were some other bubbles before that. We tend to forget that these have happened, going all the way back to tulip bulbs. But the thing is that we got this idea that the venture capitalists taught us this. They said, every idea you had, they'd always say, what's your business model? How's it going to make money? What's your business model? So, and there are a lot of things we don't want to burden with a business model. Your pants don't have a business model. Your driveway doesn't have a business model. The practical things in the world, your glasses, your cell phone, for that matter. You don't say, I'm not going to have a cell phone. How can I make money with a cell phone? How is it going to make money? You don't burden it with that duty. So there are things that only show up on the cost side that, in fact, have enormous profitability on the other side. And it's really easy to lose track of that. So there are these cost side developments that create conditions for making much more money in other ways. So, for example, Bill Gates, who knows how to make money better than any of us, I'm sure, once dismissed the net saying you just can't make money with it. And I went looking for that quote and actually found this by Dave Weiner, who's a friend of mine and one of my heroes, that he wrote in 1994, where he's saying, the users have outfoxed us again. It happens every 15 years or so in this business. We lost our ground, and users rebelled, and a new incarnation of the software business has been created. It's the internet. It's this magic thing whose potential has barely been explored. There's a rebellious spirit to it. So in 1994, Netscape hadn't been formed yet. Mosaic had just come along, and Dave was already on top of this. I'll talk a little bit more about Dave later. But Bill Gates has changed his mind about the net, but he has not changed his mind about open source. He's still fighting open source, and he's still losing, I think. So open source has been actually misunderstood since the beginning. We've all, a lot of us here, I think most of us are open source people, or, and to those of us who are open source guys, this is in some ways remedial, but I'm hoping I can help with evangelizing it a little bit. Back in the beginning, it was known as free software. and actually it was known, and before it was even called free software, but Richard Stallman coined that. This is a picture I took of Richard on the beach in the Caribbean on a Linux Lunacy geek cruise. He almost didn't go because we didn't call it the GNU Linux Lunacy geek cruise, but everything was already printed. So Richard is his own man pages. He will tell you how to do everything. But I don't know anybody else who would go to, on a hot day, to a beach in the Caribbean with a laptop and long dark pants, but that's something Richard would do. Anyway, he also had the hottest chick there. It was a really interesting thing. You wouldn't expect it necessarily, but you know, it's geek love. Anyway, but free software was never about cheaping out. There's this assumption on the part of people who aren't hip to free software. It's all about getting cheap or free stuff, but it's not. As Stallman himself said, it's not free as in beer, it's free as in freedom, which is the title of a book about him. And it's an important distinction, but it's not one everybody gets, because free still does mean costs nothing. When you say free, it has this other meaning, which means it's not going to cost you anything. And that, to a lot of people in business, is a big appeal of open source. So as a name, open source was created, it was already in use to some degree, but it was really evangelized, starting with a group of people that included Bruce Perens, and who was credited with actually pushing the name through, but it was actually Eric Raymond who did the best job of evangelizing it. And I think he's the best salesman for that, and still is. This is on a different geek cruise. He was not there with Stallman. I'm not sure they could both be on the same boat. He's reading The Island of the Sequin Love Nuttons during mustering for safety on the thing. But he wrote this book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is still a worthy read and something worth laying on people almost 10 years after it was written. And it worked. I mean, the thing is that, you know, even back then, the evangelism of the open source idea has worked. The term open source is now widely used, and not just in technology circles, but it's still misunderstood, especially oddly by IT, because it's still seen as just a commodity. It's seen as a way to cheap out, a way to get free code or free labor. I translated that into the English, you'll notice, from the American. And something not serious, you know, it's not serious unless it's commercial. If you can't buy it from a vendor, it can't be a serious thing, right? It's something vendorless and therefore unaccountable. And if you can't account for it, if you can't show up on a spreadsheet, if you can't push it through the financial system in some way, it's not serious and not real in some ways. Companies understand things they get billed for, right? And the people they can call up or people they can sue. And it's really hard to do that with this. It's kind of like suing granite or suing gravity or sunlight. It doesn't quite work. But open source is bigger than code, actually, and it's actually as big as the whole net. In fact, it is the net. It was born there. It helped make the net happen. And it's important to understand the net as this whole other world. This is not orthodox open sourceism. This is me talking now. But I think what we've done with the net is created a second world that lives right next door to the one that we're already in. That's a physical one. It's a virtual world that has its own rules. And those rules are very different in some ways. They're the same in some ways, but they're different in some ways. But you know, one that was built with freedom and because effects out the wazoo, which I couldn't translate into English, but you can probably guess what it means. In any case, there's the because effects of the net are incalculable. Could you even begin to say what the economic benefits of the net are? They're not really even measurable. It's not even a sensible question to bring up. But it's a huge thing because the net was built on open source principles. And the net is the biggest example that we have of open source at work. And by the way, it never would have come from any large company, you know, not working alone. Large companies had something to do with it, but it was mostly achieved over the objections and over the resistance of large companies all over the place. So in simplest terms, open source is just free building material. It's free, that is, not as in freedom, but free as in rocks. You know, free as in trees, free as in the periodic table. You know, if you think about the because effects of the periodic table, you know, think about who owns it. You know, who owns oxygen or who owns gallium or some other thing. Actually, I don't know chemistry, but I actually wanted to write a parody thing where we have this silly thing in the US where we're auctioning off all kinds of things that are essentially public, like spectrum. So And I know you do this over. You auction Spectrum over here too. It's silly, and you know. And I was thinking, well, you know, the Bush administration announces an auction of the periodic table, you know, and so maybe the oil companies could buy carbon, you know, and you know, and maybe the PR companies could buy, you know, some kind of exhaust. I don't know. Anyway, but nobody owns it. You know, in fact, what happens is that open source occurs in human nature. It occurs in nature, but it occurs in a human form of nature, which is, and this is these are drawings from Hugh MacLeod. How many people here read Gaping Void and know Hugh? He's like the #1 blogger in England, and I'll show him later. But I just asked him a while ago for another client that I have to come up with a bunch of things that illustrated open source. I'm using some of those here. It sources human creativity, but more to the point, it's the ability to create what we need, or as the hackers put it, to scratch our own itch. The web, for example, you know, which is an open sourcey thing. It's basically just some open standards that Tim Berners-Lee came up with, was created so he could share documents with other people in high energy physics. He needed to be able to do that. It wasn't because he had an RFP and or something, or, you know, an RFC, and he wanted to, you know, create a special spec and he was going to make a lot of money off it. No, he had a practical need. It was an itch, and he scratched that itch. So with open source, we get to create a periodic table of essentially limitless size. It's like the periodic table, but it's different because we can keep making more and more of it. So think of open source as a kind of limitless building material. There used to be, I don't know, people talk about LAMP as much as they used to. When there were only 4 letters, really, it made sense. There was Linux, Apache, PHP, Perl, Python, Postgres, and then now that list is like several 100,000 letters long. There's more open source stuff happening all the time. There's more free building material just laying around because more and more programmers have scratched an itch of one kind or another, and this stuff is just laying around and it's ready to be put to use. There's almost too much of it because you can't possibly. I'm finding this out with this project I'm working on with a community that's grown around it. With my work with the Berkman Center at Harvard, which is we can't even begin to contemplate all the different building material pieces that are laying around. It's an embarrassment of riches. But the interesting thing now is, unlike the periodic table, open source is improvable. You know, God made that, or you know, whatever made that. But with open source, you can keep tweaking it and making it a little bit better. So it has this characteristic that we call NEA, which stands for nobody owns it, everybody can use it, and anybody can improve it. And it's in this last sense that open source is different, because anybody can improve it. So Hugh MacLeod, this is Hugh, who does the Gaping Void cartoons, he wrote this up. And you know, every open source product is like a new element in the periodic table, all of which just keeps improving. So he's actually contributed some code to to my pitch, right, to the thinking that I've got about this subject. So he draws and writes that, and I advise going there because he's a very funny guy. An interesting thing too is he makes money as a blogger. You know, that's what he does. He blogs and he makes a pile of money off of that. He's taken a South African wine company called Stormhook, and just by blogging about them has just vastly increased their market share and their success in the world. He has a friend named Thomas Mahan, who's a Savile tailor, who is just another guy, just another tailor, but he talked to Hugh and they put together a blog called English Cut. And this guy, I don't know if he's the #1 tailor now or not, but he might as well be. He's making a lot of money, you know, going all over the world because he's got the one blog that explains that business to everybody. He's essentially open sourced all these sort of secrets of how you make a fine suit. It's a pretty amazing thing. So NEA is what makes the world and changes it constantly. So this is what's so different about the net from the world that we were given in the first place, the physical world. We can keep improving it. We can keep tweaking it. We can keep adding more stuff to it. And at certain points in different businesses, critical masses get reached, and all of a sudden everything changes. So the choice is to fight it or to take advantage of it. Not adapt to it, but to take advantage of it. So we're reaching what Eric Raymond first called GandhiCon 4. Gandhi, here's Mohandas Gandhi, And what he said once was, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And it's been kind of like that. Nobody, you know, it's been almost a non-violent kind of thing, the way open source has succeeded. Nobody got assassinated yet, as far as I know, but as Gandhi did. But here's a case in point. So in the New York Times, this is like several days ago, okay. New York Times opens up code, and there's this thing near the New York Times likes open source so much that it gradually moves more of its print operations online. And here's one of those, you know, items from the LAMP stack that's now several 100,000 letters long, something called XLS cache and DB Slayer, whatever. And there's another line down here that didn't make it onto the slide, which has the name of one of the two hackers working at the New York Times that are doing this. And it turns out they're just doing it. They just did it on their own for the most part. The Times is complying, because Times probably doesn't even know what they're doing, really. These guys are out there releasing code. So I looked up the guy, and it's one of them. Here's Derek Gottfried, and that's a tech guy at the Times. That's a shot done by Dave Weiner, who had the quote from 1994 that I mentioned earlier. Here's Derek's blog, which is at the New York Times, and here's one of his entries from September or whatever. But he's out there blogging about what he's releasing. And here's Dave. So I want to bring this up because I want you to watch what's happening with Dave Weiner right now. Dave isn't just anybody. Dave is just the most amazing dude. He's never patented anything. He's never had an urge to patent anything. He was not actually part of the open source movement. He actually worked against it. He pushed against it because he thought, well, I want to make money. And he didn't get it that well at first. But he's one of the best exemplars of it because, he's driven OPML, which is just beginning to come into its own. The whole notion of taking an outline and turning it into a presentation, which he invented, and which Microsoft and the people before that who created PowerPoint and then Microsoft have essentially knocked off. The outliner in Word was something that Dave created originally. He never said, give that back to me or anything like that. He's probably the father of blogging. He's the guy who forced me to get into blogging. He stood over me and said, you're going to use my software and you're going to blog. And it's one of the best things anybody ever did, for me anyway. He created XML RPC, worked with Microsoft and other companies on SOAP. He's the one who didn't create RSS. It was originally called Rich Site Summary, and it was something that Netscape did. But Dave took it, called it really simple syndication, which is beautiful marketing language for it, and said what it actually did. And then drove it through the New York. He went to the people to hackers at the New York Times and said, here's what you all guys ought to do. And New York Times was one of the first to actually use RSS. And they did that at a high level and then forgot about Dave, who never made a dime off of that at that time anyway. He pushed podcasting. It was his inclusion of the include element, I think, in RSS 2.0 that made podcasting possible. He's now adding hacks all over the place to Twitter. It's not his invention. It's Evan Williams and some other folks, but who are also blogging grandparents. But Dave has done great hacks on Twitter. And now he's doing Rivers of News. So you probably haven't heard much about news rivers yet, but you will. This is an idea Dave had several years ago, which is very simple. All you do is you just take RSS feeds or searches on Technorati or Google Blog Search for particular word strings, and you flow them into something that's simple HTML and you can look at on a cell phone or on a handheld. So they're very simple, handy, and live, and they go anywhere. This is from last night. This is the River of News. You see it says at the top there, nytimesriver.com. That's his domain. He's doing it for the Times. He's carrying them on this. The New York Times has spent millions of dollars on content management systems, and Dave has done this on his own, and that's probably the best thing that the Times is doing right now, and they're not even doing it. This is looking at the same thing on a Nokia handheld. Here's the same thing on my otherwise terrible Palm 700, P700 cell phone. And I mean, that's a terrible phone to be reading something on, and it comes up just like that because it's just simple HTML. So it's a free and open idea with some code, that's already written, but a lot more needed. So I was corresponding with Dave last night, and his position on it is, I hope somebody writes it, and probably somebody will, because he's done the basic work for it, and there's faith that other people are going to step forward and do that. So the Times is actually releasing code, if we're looking at it at a strategic level, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they actually are at a top level saying, yeah, we actually do love open source, we actually are going to release code. because it makes their market bigger. And obviously, they've got a first mover advantage in a bigger market. Just as releasing Open Adapter did for J.P. Rangaswamy and his team, many of which are now here, at Dresdner Kleinroot Wasserstein. There's the Open Adapter logo, and there's a picture of JP from an interview that I did with him around that. I guess it was about a year and a half ago, something like that. I think he was still there at the time. And it's now happening with breaking news. And it's an interesting thing how open source works, how subversive it is. A little over a year ago, on my blog, I used to be in the newspaper business 1,000 years ago, and I've been in it off and on because I write a lot of stuff, and some of it I do for newspapers, and I write for a monthly magazine, and newspapers are so clueless about how they're losing it. You know, they want to, they think print is still the center of the world, and they've got this monthly or weekly or even daily heartbeat. In the meantime, the users are running all around them, and there are so many more sources of news than there ever were before. And they're just trying to deal. So I wrote this 10-point thing that said, here are 10 things newspapers need to do. You need to open your archives, you need to work with bloggers, you need to do rivers of news, you need to do some other things like that. And what happened is that they pretty much ignored that, even though it was actually, that piece that I wrote was pretty well covered by people who were in the newspaper business. There's a guy named Romanesco who's like a high-level, very widely read commentator on journalistic issues, and he pointed to it. And everybody pretty much said, yeah, they're clueless and they ought to listen to this. But nothing happened until this last 2 weeks. That's when we had huge fires in San Diego. Maybe you've heard about this, but JP almost didn't fly to San Diego because they had 500,000 refugees from houses that might burn down. So I mean, fires, I live in California most of the time, except when I'm doing the work I'm doing now in Boston. But they're pretty frightening. The state was basically made to be burned over. You shouldn't have people there. It should be a big national park. It makes no sense to actually have civilization there, but we do. And between the earthquakes as well, it's an amazing thing. Redwoods, the state tree for California, they go 300 feet high, and they have short branches and thick bark that the branches don't commence for 200 feet. The reason they're like that is because they're adapted to fire. So what does that say about California? The state flower is the California poppy, this little orange flower, and it's all along the roadsides. And they grow in areas that are extremely mineral rich because they live off rocks that have recently broken up. Well, it means they're adapted to earthquakes. So that's another thing. So with this breaking news, the news organizations are playing catch up, and they're following other leaders, which are their readers who also hack. So here's an example. This is from the San Diego County Wildfires 2007 blog. It's a Blogspot blog. Blogspot is owned by Google. It's one of the things that Google's doing badly. They bought Blogger and have kind of like sat on Blogspot and haven't really improved it a great deal. 6apart came along with TypePad, and WordPress, which is an open source effort, is just totally stripping the gears of Google with that. So 95% of what's on Blogger now, the new stuff on Blogger, is all spam blogs. But the San Diego Union Tribune, which has this big, complicated content management system, couldn't deal with the fires. Their management system wasn't up to it. So what did they do? They went to Blogspot on Google, runs entirely on Linux, right? It's free, and they did a blog, just like any schmuck would do off the street if they want to start a blog, right? Go to Blogger, start a blog. And it was very practical, and they're still running it, right? This is a happening blog right now that the newspaper's doing for no cost whatsoever, while they're paying probably a dozen or more people to continue to work on the content management system to make it better and better. So, and here's another one, Network News in a Box. There's a guy named Gabe Watchub. He used to be an executive with Visa. He's an open source guy. He's working, I think, for VeriSign now. I'm not sure. And so he just wrote, here's Network News in a Box. Here's how to do it, how to create an instant grassroots-driven network. He did it, what was built for the San Diego fires, Twitter. I learned about there was an earthquake in California yesterday in the San Jose area last night. I learned about it on Twitter. How many people here use Twitter, have played with Twitter at all? It's another open source hack. You're twittering this very thing. There we go. So I'm following Paul, the whole thing. There's so many guys here named Paul, so that's an easy thing to say. So what's happening is that, you know, supply and demand, which used to be this thing where the few supplied the many and there were the few producers and the million consumers, that system is going away because of the net. It's still there, but it lives in this other environment because anybody can play in the supply and demand game. Anybody can supply. Anybody can demand. The demand side can supply itself. So, you know, there's another one of Hugh's cartoons, Open Source Humanity being the biological norm. It's about the demand side supplying itself for everybody's good. It starts with the hackers, but now anybody can do it. You know, there's something called hashtags that it happens to be a hacker, but just operating in a reader role that Chris Messina, who's one of the developers of Flock, and before that he was with Mozilla, came up with just the other day. You know, here's another little thing that we can do with Twitter or with anything else called hashtags that make it easier for you to follow news one way or another. So we've seen this before. Actually, open source is not a new thing. We've seen this before, in fact, 150 years ago, more than 150 years ago, with construction. Here's a house. Actually, that's a house that we built in California. It took us 4 years to build it before we moved away because I got this gig in Boston. But anyway, we still own it, and I got to see us build it, and it was a lot of fun to watch. My wife really ran the job, but in the course of it, I actually had a lot of insight about open source. Because construction actually works on an open source model. It is about NEA in the same kind of ways. Nobody owns it, everybody can use it, anybody can improve the methods that are used. If somebody figures out a better way to hang a door or to put up tile or some other thing, like they don't keep it a secret saying, I've got this proprietary way of putting a door on and I'm not going to let anybody know and it's my intellectual property. No, they'll share it with the crew because they'll get more respect from that crew and it's going to spread. It doesn't even occur to anybody to try and lock that stuff up. So the modern construction industry actually has a beginning. I mean, construction has been around since the earth cooled. It's like a $5 trillion industry worldwide. I think it's probably drugs and porn are close to it in size, but it's probably the largest legitimate industry. And that was when a guy named Augustine Taylor and a crew of we call them DIY carpenters. They were not professional carpenters. Professional carpenters up to that point were guys that knew mortise and tenon and dovetail joints and how to put pegs into hand-hewn timbers and so forth, and how to mix up the goop that you put on the walls between the timbers and the rest of it. And it was a great deal of art and craft that went into building anything, and it was expensive. But they did it for $400, and they did it with guys that were not professional carpenters, because what Augustine Taylor figured out how to do was how to make 2x4s and 2x6s. Cut nails were already around. They've been around since the 1790s. But this is, you know, they were already cutting boards to some degree for the exteriors of buildings. But to make them framing members, to build on a frame of studs and joists was a new thing. He's the guy who basically invented it. And the regular craftsmen called it balloon construction, because hot air balloons were kind of big novelties in the early 1800s, and they were kind of rare, but there was a lot of talk about them. And of course, a lot of them caught fire because you had to heat them with fire, and they blew over easily, and the rest of it, and so they were considered dangerous. And so the craftsmen called this, that was balloon construction because it's going to blow down. And balloon construction actually became the name for frame construction for a long time. There's still a variety of frame construction called balloon construction. But the cool thing is that you could build anything with this. Everything after that became frame construction. And in the US especially, and it was similar to a situation that prevailed in Europe in the Middle Ages and a bit later, which is that there was an abundance of lumber. There was abundance of free lumber that regenerated itself. That didn't happen so much here because you have the moors where there used to be forests, but in the US, especially the upper Midwest, you could cut down whole forests of trees and more of them would grow up almost immediately. So pine especially was almost free. You know, the lumber in the US is almost free. That's one of the things that made the US as prosperous as it was. Essentially the building materials are free and anybody could build anything. And so there was this construction boom that happened. So we build software the same way, but with materials from our heads. And I don't think it's any accident that we have these things called architects and designers and builders, or that we construct software and we call it a series of builds. the difference with open source is that our building materials and methods work best when they're not secret and not proprietary. This is a lot like the construction industry. Again, there are secrets in the construction industry. There are, and I left several slides out of here for time reasons, but the point here is that if you're going to build a house, they're going to have lots of proprietary stuff in there. You know, there may be proprietary door latches, there may be proprietary fasteners, there may be proprietary flooring materials, there may be all kinds of things that have patents listed on them and the rest of it, but they don't constrain what you can do. There's no Microsoft in the construction industry. Nobody, Weyerhaeuser or Southern Pacific or Georgia Pacific, Southern Pacific's a railroad, but you know, there is no company that's going to tell you, you're going to have to build a house on our platform, whatever that is. It's a ludicrous notion. It doesn't make any sense at all. You're going to build a house with whatever makes sense and with whatever the architect and the builders can configure. It's modular. It's inherently modular. And it's this modular nature that makes open source so easy to create and so easy to deploy. So let's look at where this fits in civilization. So this is in part to put governance in perspective. There's this thing, have you heard of longnow.org? This is this organization that's building a clock that goes bong once every 10,000 years. And don't wait, right? So you're going to put it in Nevada somewhere in some mountain. And, but the thing is to give us a long view of things. And Stuart Brand, who wrote a brilliant book, by the way, called How Buildings Learn, which I highly recommend getting. It has lines in it like form follows funding, which is perfect. It's, by the way, one other reason why we have open source, I think. So the point he was making with this was that was actually one about speed, that nature moves slowly and culture a little faster and governance faster, but and then infrastructure, commerce, and fashion at the top. But an interesting thing about this is that there are dependencies involved, where culture depends on nature and governance on culture and infrastructure on governance. From below, there's this supportive nature to things, but the ones above also put these to use. Culture puts nature to use, governance puts culture to use, infrastructure puts governance to use. There's a way that these things work together. It's an oversimplified thing, but you get the idea. So an interesting point, though, is that the Net's founders, the people who were involved in that, John Postel and Doug Engelbart and Vince Cerf, who gave me a ride to the airport the other day and told me, yeah, there are problems with TCP/IP. I'm sorry. What can I do? JCR Licklider, Larry Roberts, all these guys, they weren't really coming from fashion and commerce. They were coming from below, you know. So they were coming from down here. So infrastructure is what goes under a platform. You know, we talk about platforms, and we stay with the construction metaphor. It's sort of kind of the geology of things. You know, and so an interesting thing is that it supports what relies on it. You know, it has no secrets. It's, you know, it's free. It's, you know, it occurs in human nature. Again, the NEA point. So techies generally want infrastructure to support business, but they don't necessarily care about it. You know, I love hearing Linus Torvalds. When anybody asks him, what's going to happen with Linux on the laptop and so forth, he says, oh, I just do kernel space. That's user space. You know, I'm just down here with gravity. You know, I'm making a better core in the earth, and you guys can do whatever the hell you please on the top. We'll just make this a little better down here, right? And Richard Stallman's the same way. They're all coming from there. But they wanted to support business. It's not like they were against business. It's like, you know, the earth is not against anything that's done on it. It's just indifferent to it. But infrastructure supports markets. You know, you can't have markets with infrastructure sitting under them. So now it's time to show something called the Burton matrix. My friend Craig Burton, who's on the upper left here, he's one of the fathers of Novell's success in the 80s. A quick point about him. Anybody got any idea how much time I have left? Just to 3 minutes? That's all? Okay. I won't tell you what he did. But a point that he made was that open source people tend to say, you know, closed and proprietary is bad, and other stuff is, you know, open and is good. And he says that is a distinction that actually doesn't work, because if you get past the politics, you've got a useful strategic framework where what you can do is take stuff that is closed and proprietary or open and proprietary and move it over here and make it into infrastructure. So that's what even Apple, which is a fairly proprietary company, did that with floppies. They did it with ZeroConf. They've done it with a pile of other things, USB. And infrastructure is what has the most because effects. So you fit these two things together, and I'll hurry through this. You've got infrastructure in both of these. If you take the thing on the left and kind of rock it 45 degrees on the right, you've got proprietary and closed and commerce happening in the top, and infrastructure and open and public domain happening at the bottom. And this is a diagram for the symbiotic relationship between these two domains, the commercial and the non-commercial. And this is how it ought to work, where infrastructure supports commerce and commerce contributes to infrastructure. People working in open source at companies contribute stuff like humus coming down onto the ground that other things can grow in. You know, commoditization, in fact, is contribution, and it's a good thing. It's what you do for your markets, yourself, and the rest of civilization. But business too often sees it this way. No, we have patents, and we have copyrights, and we have IP laws, and we're going to make all those part of infrastructure. You're going to sit on that stuff, right? And we're going to own what you sit on. We're going to own the customer. We're going to own the marketplace. And that doesn't work in the long run. You know, in the long run, that fails. So commerce contributes, but doesn't necessarily drive the bus anymore. And we have to face the fact that the open network world is what we're building and where we'll live. And so open source is moving business from this is Hugh again, from egology to ecology, from a self-centeredness, a kind of pyramid-shaped thing, to an ecology where anybody can contribute. And top-down control doesn't work like it used to. So what can a big company like DBT do? And the short answer is our job is to side with the winners. And you know, this is another Hugh's drawing. Here's before and there's after. And the winners are the demand side supplying itself. We have to help that happen. So that's I think I got it. I skipped some stuff in there, but good. Thank you.